The buttons were mother of pearl, 43 of them, running from the base of her spine to the nape of her neck. Clarissa had counted them during the fitting and had thought, at the time, that they were beautiful. She had not thought about the morning after. She had sent the maid away that on the silver tray beside the wash basin, weighted against the draught from the ill-fitting window, was a folded note. She had read it once already, but she read it again now. Because she was the kind of person who preferred to be certain, you're expected at the parish council meeting at ten.no signature. No salutation. No acknowledgement that 12 hours prior, in a church in Mayfair with 200 witnesses and a bishop who kept losing his place in the text, she had become his wife. Last night, in the doorway between the corridor and this chamber, Alexander had paused. She had thought, for a moment. But she had learned, over the course of 3 years, not to assign too much significance to pauses that he had said, "Pretend you love me," not a request. Exactly. Not a command. Something in between the register of a man issuing an instruction he already knew was insufficient, offering it anyway because he had nothing better. Then he had stepped back into the corridor, and she had heard his footsteps recede down the hall. And that had been that. She reached behind her back and began, methodically, to work the first button free, through the windows of the Duchess' chamber. November light arrived in the particular grey manner of the Yorkshire moors, neither dawn nor morning but something suspended between the two. The bed behind her was made. Perfectly made, on his side. The counterpane so precisely arranged that it might have been a room in a house where no one lived. He had left before first light. Above the fireplace, the portrait watched her work. The late Duke of Redfield, rendered in oils beside his 2 sons. The elder stood at his father's right hand, fair, straight-shouldered, with the ease of a man who had never been required to imagine a version of his life in which he was not its protagonist. Adrian. Even in paint he managed to look as though the world had arranged itself for his convenience. The younger son stood at the frame's left edge. Dark-haired. Somewhat narrower in the shoulder. His chin tilted at an angle that might have been pride or might have been the posture of a person accustomed to being cropped from the composition. Alexander. He looked like a man who had spent considerable effort learning to occupy less space. She had studied that portrait often. During the 18 months she had spent watching Adrian die, the coughing had begun in the second winter of their engagement. By the third winter it was no longer dry. She had been present the first time it drew blood. The maid had left the room. Clarissa had not. When I'm gone, Adrian had said. On one of his better evenings, his voice still carrying that particular quality of lightness he deployed against everything he couldn't fix, "Alex will need someone." She had assumed he meant a housekeeper. That assumption had lasted until 4 months ago. When the solicitor arrived with the terms of the family arrangement and a great deal of careful language about continuation of alliance and the interests of the estate, and she had understood, with the clarity that comes from having already survived one thing you didn't expect to survive, that Adrian had not meant a housekeeper at all. The wedding had been quiet. A second wedding tended toward the quiet. 39th button. 40th, she looked at herself in the glass. This face had smiled for 8 hours yesterday. It could manage another day. Tomorrow as well. This, she thought, working the 42nd button free, was a job she knew how to do. She had been pretending since the first morning Adrian's coughing drew blood, and she had looked at him and smiled and said, "It's all right. Lie back down." She had been pretending since the afternoon she signed the engagement papers and said perfectly without a single tremor in her voice. She had been pretending since the wedding yesterday, and she would be pretending at the parish council meeting at 10. And she would be pretending at every dinner and every assembly and every Sunday service in the village church where Adrian's name was now carved in marble. Her new husband had asked her to pretend she loved him. He had not needed to ask. She had arrived already fluent in the language. The 40th IRD button came free. She caught the gown before it fell. The parish council met in the east drawing room, which had the advantage of a large table and the disadvantage of a portrait of the first Duke of Redfield that seemed to register disapproval of everything occurring beneath it. Clarissa arrived at 5 minutes to 10. Alexander was already there, standing at the window with a sheaf of documents and the expression of a man who had decided, as a matter of principle, to treat every room he entered as a problem requiring resolution. He looked up when she came in. He did not say good morning, Lady Ashworth will be late. He said instead, Pemberton arrives at 10. The matter of the Haverstock tenancy needs resolution before Christmas. Good morning, Clarissa said. A pause, in which he appeared to locate the social requirement. Good morning. She took the chair at the table's midpoint, not at the foot, which would have suggested deference, and not at the head, which was his, and opened her notebook. She had been keeping notes on the Redfield estate accounts since Adrian's second winter, when he had been too exhausted to manage the correspondence himself. She knew the name of every tenant, every supplier, every creditor, and every obligation outstanding. She had reason to believe Alexander did not know she knew this. She had reason, this morning, to change that. Pemberton arrived at 3 minutes past abroad. Grey man with the bearing of someone who had been important in this county since before Alexander was born and intended to remain so regardless of which brother held the title. He greeted Alexander with elaborate cordiality and acknowledged Clarissa with the nod one gives to furniture that has been rearranged without consultation. Whitmore followed shortly after, younger and more cautious. The kind of man who watched which way the room was leaning before he committed to a direction, or grace. Pemberton settled into his chair with the authority of a man who had occupied it for 20 years. The tithe assessments first, I think. Then the Haverstock tenancy. And he arranged his papers, the charitable provisions. The late Duke maintained several arrangements under his personal patronage. With the change in circumstances, these will require review. Which arrangements specifically? Clarissa asked. Pemberton looked at her with the expression of a man who has been asked a question by a piece of furniture. The primary concern, he said, redirecting smoothly toward Alexander, is the Redfield Children's Convalescent Home. A worthy endeavor. However, the late Duke's patronage was personal in nature, and the question of continuation. The home operates on an annual cost of £340. Clarissa said. Current donor commitments cover 260. The remaining 80 has historically come from ducal patronage. She turned a page in her notebook. The lease on the Ansford Road property runs through March. The medical supply contract with Whitfield and Sons was last renewed in August and contains a 60-day exit clause. If a decision on continuation isn't made by the end of November, the staff will begin seeking other placements. And the children currently in residence will need to be relocated before winter is out. The room had gone rather quiet. Pemberton's eyes moved from her notebook to her face. She met them pleasantly. I managed the administrative correspondence and donor relations on the late Duke's behalf for the past 2 years, she said, as though this were information too routine to require particular emphasis. I'm familiar with the operation. If His Grace is willing to continue the patronage arrangement, I'm prepared to take on full management. Nothing need change except who signs the correspondence. She looked at Alexander. He had not moved from the window. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately classify. Not surprise, exactly. Though there was something in it that had not been present at the start of the meeting. The look of a man who has walked into a room expecting to find it empty and has instead found all the furniture precisely placed and a fire already lit. Of course. He said. 2 words. Delivered without particular inflection. But she noted that he had not looked at Pemberton before he said them, and he had not looked at his documents. He had looked at her. Very good, Pemberton said. Recovering. Then the Haverstock matter. They moved through the remaining items efficiently. Clarissa contributed 3 times, once on the question of the Haverstock boundary dispute, where she cited the relevant clause from the 1809 estate survey that Adrian had annotated in the margin. Once on the drainage assessment for the South Field, where she had figures Whitmore did not, and once, near the end, when Pemberton suggested delaying the winter coal distribution to the estate's dependent households until the new year. At which point she simply read aloud the relevant passage from last year's parish record describing what had happened the previous time coal distribution had been delayed, and the subject did not come up again, when the meeting concluded and the men had filed out. She remained to gather her notes. Alexander had not left. He stood at the window again, still She was not certain he had moved, looking out at the November grounds with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to understand was not emptiness but something closer to its opposite. A stillness that required maintenance, the 1809 survey, he said. Without turning around. Adrian annotated it. Yes, you've read it. I've read most of the estate records from the last decade. She closed her notebook. Adrian found the paperwork difficult toward the end. Someone needed to. He was quiet for a moment. Outside. A cart was making its way along the south drive, the horse's breath clouding in the cold distribution, he said. What happened the last time it was delayed? 3 families in the lower village lost an infant apiece. She said it without particular emphasis. Because it did not require any. It was a cold January. He turned from the window then. He looked at her, not the assessing look of the meeting, not the careful neutrality of the doorway last night, but something more direct. As though he was attempting to resolve a question he hadn't yet decided whether to ask. That he did not ask it. Thank you, he said instead. For the meeting that I was expected, she said. You said so in your note. She left him with that, and with the portrait of his grandfather. And with whatever question he had decided not to ask yet. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Clarissa knew it was from the estate solicitor before she opened it. She recognized the seal, the particular weight of the paper. The way Hobbs presented it on the tray with the careful neutrality of a man delivering something he suspected might be significant. Hobbs had been the Redfield house steward for 31 years. He had learned to present things neutrally. She broke the seal at the writing desk in the morning room. Read through the contents twice, and made a note in her ledger about the supply contract adjustment it required. Then she rang for Hobbs to discuss the quarterly household accounts, and they worked through the figures for 40 minutes, and it was only at the end, when she was closing the ledger, that Hobbs said. Will that be all, Your Grace? Yes, thank you. She paused. Hobbs. How long have you been with the family? 31 years, Your Grace. I came to Redfield when the late Duke, the elder Duke, that is, was first married. Then you knew both sons well. Something shifted in Hobbs' expression. Not discomfort, exactly. The look of a man navigating terrain he has crossed before and knows to be uneven. I had the privilege, yes, His Grace the current Duke. She chose the phrasing carefully. He seems to carry the estate's obligations very seriously. He always did, Hobbs said. Even before it was his to carry. A pause. The late Duke Mr. Adrian, I mean, had a gift for people. For making them feel at ease. His Grace has other qualities. Another pause. Shorter. When Mr. Adrian was first taken ill, it was His Grace who managed the correspondence that Mr. Adrian could not. Most of the estate didn't know. Mr. Adrian preferred it that way. Clarissa looked up. I didn't know that. No. Hobbs' voice was carefully even. There was a great deal managed quietly. In those years. He straightened the tray in his hands. The late Duke, the elder Duke, passed in the spring before Mr. Adrian. In his final weeks, he called His Grace to him privately. I was not present for the conversation. But afterward he stopped. Afterward? Clarissa said. Hobbs met her eyes briefly, then looked at some neutral point above her left shoulder. Forgive me, Your Grace. I've said more than is perhaps my place. He inclined his head. Will there be anything else for the accounts? She let him go. She sat for a moment at the writing desk after he had closed the door, her pen resting in her hand, the ledger open to a page of figures that suddenly seemed very far away. The elder Duke had called Alexander to him privately. Hobbs had been about to say what happened afterward. And had stopped himself, with the precise timing of a man who remembered, mid-sentence, that he had decided not to say this. She turned to a fresh page in her notebook. At the top, she wrote, What did the late Duke ask him to promise? She looked at the question for a moment. Then she closed the notebook and went to see about the supply contract. That evening, passing the library on her way to the stairs, she noticed the door was ajar. She would not have looked in. Except that the fire was lit and the lamp was on, and those were not the conditions of an empty room. Alexander was at the desk. He was reading a letter. He had been reading it, because when she passed he had stopped. And the letter was held in both hands with the stillness of a man who has been interrupted mid-thought. He did not look up immediately. When he did, the letter moved, not hidden, exactly, but lowered. Angled away from her line of sight with a naturalness that was slightly too natural, she could see one corner of it. The handwriting was not his. "That I didn't mean to disturb you," she said. "You didn't." He set the letter face down on the desk. "Was there something you needed?" "No." She looked at him for a moment, at the letter, at the angle of his shoulders, at the way his hand remained flat on the paper as though anchoring it. "Good night, Your Grace." "Good night," she continued to the stairs. Behind her, she heard nothing. No resumption of turning pages. No movement. Only the silence of a man sitting very still in a lit room, waiting for the sound of her footsteps to recede. The handwriting on that letter, she thought as she climbed, had looked like Adrian's. The Ashworth ball was the first significant event of the London season. Which meant it was the first opportunity for 200 members of the peerage to form opinions about the new Duchess of Redfield that would calcify into permanent positions by Easter. Clarissa understood this. She had, accordingly, taken considerable care with her appearance. The dark green silk was new, the pearls were the Redfield stones that had arrived from the vault with a terse note from the housekeeper explaining they were traditional, and the overall effect in the mirror had been, she judged, sufficiently appropriate for a woman attending her first major public engagement as the wife of a duke who had told her, 4 weeks ago, to pretend that I in the carriage. Alexander had reviewed the evening's requirements. "The Ashworths will want to present you formally in the first hour. Accept graciously, keep your answers brief. Lady Hardcastle will ask about children. She asks everyone about children, it's compulsive. Not malicious. You can deflect to the estate. Lord Fenwick has a grudge against the family that predates my tenure and should be treated with distant cordiality." He had been looking at the window as he spoke, the lamplight catching the line of his jaw. "If Pemberton's wife approaches you, she's hoping to find evidence that you're unsuitable. Don't give her any. Is there anything you'd like me to actually say?" Clarissa asked. "Or only the things I shouldn't?" He had looked at her then. "Briefly. Say whatever you like. Within reason." That's very generous. That he had returned to the window. The Ashworth ballroom was everything Yorkshire was not. Blazing chandeliers, hothouse flowers in November. The orchestrated din of 300 people performing their social obligations with varying degrees of skill. Clarissa moved through the presentation hour with the ease of long practice, saying the correct things to the correct people in the correct register. Smiling at Lady Hardcastle's inquiry about heirs with the expression she had perfected over the question of Adrian's declining health, present, warm, and entirely uninformative. She was discussing the York Road improvements with a baronet whose name she had already noted in her ledger when she became aware of a presence at her left shoulder. "My dear." The voice was pitched for intimacy, which in a room this size meant it was pitched to be overheard by the 4 people nearest to them. "How brave of you to come out so soon." The woman who had materialized at her side was perhaps 40. Dressed in the particular manner of someone who had once been considered a great beauty and had decided that the most dignified response to the passage of time was to dress as though nothing had changed. Clarissa did not know her face, but she recognized the tone, the affectionate pity of someone delivering a wound wrapped in concern. "Lady Voss," the baronet supplied, with the helpfulness of a man who wanted to be elsewhere. "Lady Voss, may I present the Duchess of Redfield?" "Oh, we must speak privately," Lady Voss said, taking Clarissa's arm with a warmth that did not reach her grip. "There's something I feel I ought to say, one woman to another, before the evening goes further." She drew Clarissa a few steps aside, not far enough for privacy, which Clarissa suspected was entirely intentional. "I was so terribly fond of Adrian. We all were. He was so." She paused for the appropriate effect, "vivid. And your situation is so unusual, isn't it? First one brother, then the other. In some cultures it would be entirely unremarkable. But here." Another pause. "People will form their own conclusions, I'm afraid. I only mention it because I think it's kinder to warn you." Clarissa looked at her. Lady Voss had the bright Anticipatory expression of a woman who expected either flustered gratitude or visible distress and was prepared to enjoy either. That's very thoughtful of you, Clarissa said. I've always found that when people say they mention something out of kindness, they've generally already mentioned it to several others out of interest. She let that settle for precisely one beat. The convalescent home spring fundraising is in March. I believe you attended last year. The subscription list shows a contribution under your husband's name. We'd be very glad to count on it again. Lady Voss blinked. That if you'll excuse me, Clarissa said, pleasantly, I believe Lord Ashworth is trying to catch my eye. Lord Ashworth was not trying to catch her eye. But by the time Lady Voss had processed this, Clarissa was already crossing the room. And the baronet had developed a sudden interest in the floral arrangements. She did not immediately rejoin the main reception. She paused instead at the edge of the room near the terrace doors, allowing herself 30 seconds of stillness, a practice she had developed in the latter months of Adrian's illness. When 30 seconds was sometimes all the time available between one demand and the next, she was on her 22nd second when Alexander appeared at her side. She had not heard him cross the room. He moved quietly for a large man, which she had noticed before and filed without comment. Lady Voss, he said. Not a question. She was very kind, Clarissa said. She wanted to warn me. About what? The conclusions people will form. She looked out at the terrace, where two younger guests had escaped the heat and were talking too close together in the cold. She's already formed hers, of course. She was just good enough to share them. Alexander was quiet for a moment. She was aware of him looking at her profile rather than at the terrace, with the quality of attention she had noticed twice before at the parish meeting, at the library door. It was not the attention of a man making a social calculation. It was more deliberate than that. You handled it well, he said. She turned to look at him. You were watching, yes. Were you waiting to see if I'd need assistance? Something moved across his face that she could not name. No, he said. I was watching because he stopped. Started again with the slight adjustment of a man choosing a different approach. You did well. I wanted you to know I noticed. Clarissa looked at him for a long moment. His expression had the quality she associated with the portrait. The younger son at the edge of the frame, holding himself with careful economy. You're grading me again, she said. That I am not. You told me in the carriage to keep my answers brief and not give Pemberton's wife evidence of unsuitability. She kept her voice level, conversational. In the register of two people discussing the weather in a crowded room. You've been watching to assess performance. You said you noticed. That is, by most definitions, a grade. That isn't what I meant. Then what did you mean? He held her gaze. The orchestra had moved into a waltz, and the floor had filled, and the light from the chandeliers was doing the thing it did at this hour, softening everything into the particular amber that made ballrooms look, from the inside, like a painting of themselves. That I meant, he said. That you didn't need me. She considered that. It was a different thing from what she had expected him to say, and it landed differently, not as a compliment, exactly, but as an observation with some weight behind it, as though the fact of it mattered to him more than the saying of it. She said. I didn't. That he was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense of something working in him that he would not let reach his face. Will you dance? He said. She looked at the floor, then at him. Is that an assessment exercise as well? It's a waltz, he said. That's all. She let him lead her out. That he danced correctly. Of course he did everything correctly. It was beginning to seem like a defining characteristic, but there was nothing mechanical about it. He moved with the kind of economy that came from genuine competence rather than rehearsed performance, and she found, somewhat against her expectations, that it was not unpleasant to be guided by someone who knew what he was doing. They had completed one turn of the floor when he said, quietly, what did you say to her? Lady Voss. That I redirected to the fundraising subscription. A pause. That's. He seemed to be locating the right word. Efficient. She came to cause damage. I gave her an invoice instead. Clarissa kept her eyes at the level of his shoulder, where they were supposed to be. The subscription, incidentally, is genuine. She donated £18 last year. I'll be writing to confirm the renewal in January. You remember the exact amount that I remember all the amounts. Another turn. The chandeliers swept overhead. She was aware of the room the way they were being observed, not intrusively, but with the peripheral attention of people who had noted the new Duchess of Redfield and were waiting to see what conclusions to draw. You're very good at this, he said. It was not the tone of a compliment. It was the tone of a man arriving at the end of a calculation. Yes, she said. I am. He looked down at her. She looked up. They were close enough, in the mechanics of the waltz, that she could see the point at which his expression shifted not into warmth, exactly, but into something that was the absence of the careful distance he maintained in every other circumstance, as though proximity had briefly suspended it. That I told you in the carriage to say whatever you liked, he said. Within reason, you did that. Is there anything you'd actually like to say? Not to Lady Voss. To me. She considered it genuinely the question, the particular quality of stillness in his face as he waited for an answer. Yes, she said. But I don't think this is the moment. When would be the moment? When you stop treating conversation like an assessment exercise, she said. They'll stop treating it like a performance. That seems fair, the music resolved. He stepped back, she stepped back. They were the appropriate distance apart again, in the appropriate public register, and the room continued around them as though nothing had occurred. Fair, he said. After a moment. The word had something careful in it, like a man testing whether a floor would hold his weight. All right, she inclined her head. She moved back toward the reception, and she did not look behind her. And she did not permit herself to examine too closely the fact that her pulse had not entirely returned to its usual rate until she was halfway across the room. She found him at the grave on a Tuesday. It was not something she had planned. She had risen early because the supply ledger required at tension before the Whitfield representative arrived at 9, and the path to the estate office cut through the churchyard. And the morning was cold enough that her breath came in small clouds that dissolved before they reached the yew trees lining the south wall. She saw him before he saw her. He was standing at Adrian's grave with his back to the path, his coat dark against the pale November grass, his hat in his hands. He was not doing anything in particular, not laying flowers, not reading from a prayer book, not performing any of the gestures that grief, formally observed, was supposed to require. He was simply standing. In the manner of a man who has run out of productive options and has arrived, by elimination, at stillness. Clarissa stopped at the church wall. She should have continued on. She knew she should have continued on. But his shoulders had a quality she recognized, not the careful economy of the portrait, not the managed correctness of the parish meeting or the ballroom, something rawer than that, like a man in a room he believed to be empty. She stayed. She could not hear him clearly from the wall. The words arrived in fragments, carried unevenly on the cold air, his voice lower than usual. The formality stripped out of it, leaving something that did not sound like the Duke of Redfield at all. Told me to take care of her, but you didn't say. The wind moved through the yews. She thinks it's obligation. I don't know how to. A pause long enough that she thought he had finished. Then. You let me promise without telling me what it would cost. That wasn't a short stop. That wasn't fair. Adrian silenced. He stood for another moment. Then he put his hat back on, with the precise movements of a man reassembling himself, and turned to walk back toward the house. He saw her when he had covered perhaps half the distance between the grave and the path. He stopped. She did not move. They looked at each other across 20 feet of frost-pale grass, and she was aware, with uncomfortable clarity, that she had heard something she was not supposed to hear, and that he knew it, and that there was no version of the next 10 seconds in which either of them could pretend otherwise. Your Grace, she said. How long were you? He stopped. Revised. I didn't hear you. I was going to the estate office. She indicated the path. I didn't mean to intrude. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man performing a rapid private calculation. Then he nodded, once, and continued toward the house. She let him pass. She stood at the wall a moment longer after his footsteps had faded, looking at Adrian's grave, at the stone, at the fresh-turned earth that winter had not yet had time to settle, at the flowers someone had placed there recently. Now browning at the edges, she thinks it's obligation. She turned and walked to the estate office, and she did not write the sentence in her notebook. Because she found she did not need to. It had already arranged itself somewhere she would not misplace it. The letter from Mr. Dalton arrived on a Friday, and by Saturday morning the news had reached Clarissa through the housekeeper, who had it from the estate secretary, who had received the formal notice the previous afternoon. Dalton, the convalescent home's largest annual donor, was withdrawing his subscription. The stated reason was a review of charitable commitments, the actual reason which Clarissa extracted from the estate secretary in 4 minutes of patient questioning was that Dalton had attended a dinner at which someone had described the new Duchess of Redfield as an unstable appointment, given the circumstances, and Dalton, who had built his considerable fortune on the principle of attaching his name only to stable things, had drawn the obvious conclusion: the withdrawal was £90. Combined with the existing gap in the budget, it meant the home could not meet its spring obligations without either finding a replacement donor within 6 weeks or drawing on ducal patronage at a level that would require a formal request to Alexander. Clarissa read the notice twice. Then she sent a note to the housekeeper, asked for the carriage at 10:30, and went upstairs to find her coat. Hobbs intercepted her in the hall. "Your Grace's Grace has asked to be informed of any matters arising from the estate accounts." "This isn't an estate matter," Clarissa said, buttoning her coat. "It's a charitable matter. Entirely separate ledger." His Grace was quite specific. "Tell His Grace I've gone to call on Dr. Marsh." She picked up her gloves. "And that I expect to be back before luncheon." She was back before luncheon. She had found Dr. Marsh, who had been Adrian's Phy. Sickian for 11 years and had once, during a particularly difficult February, spent 4 consecutive nights in the house to ensure that the eldest son of the Duke of Redfield did not die without a doctor presenting his surgery on the Ansford Road, and had presented him with a bound volume of Adrian's personal medical observations. Adrian had kept meticulous notes in the final 2 years of his illness: dosages, symptom progressions, the small experimental adjustments he and Marsh had made together in the management of his care. The volume had been in Clarissa's possession since the estate was settled. She had kept it because she had not known what else to do with it, and because it seemed wrong to let it be catalogued with the household effects. She gave it to Marsh without ceremony. "That he would have wanted you to have this," she said. "I should have brought it sooner." Marsh looked at the volume for a long moment. He was a man in his late 50s with the weathered self-possession of someone who had spent decades in proximity to other people's worst days, and he did not easily show what he felt. But his hands, Clarissa noticed, were not entirely steady when he turned to the first page. "Your Grace," he said, after a moment, "the convalescent home has lost its primary subscription." She said, £90 annually. "I'm looking for a replacement patron, someone whose commitment to the work is based on understanding the work, not on the social convenience of being associated with it." She waited. "Adrian spoke of you often. He said you were the only doctor had met who thought medicine ought to involve listening." Marsh set the volume carefully on his desk. "What are the terms?" he said. She told him. He asked 3 questions, all of them practical, none of them about the circumstances of her marriage or the identity of the dinner guest who had called her an unstable appointment. By the time she rose to leave, the arrangement had been agreed in principle, subject to a formal letter from the estate, and Marsh had the medical observations volume open on his desk and was already reading. She returned to Redfield to find Alexander in the entrance hall. That he was not waiting for her. Precisely. He was speaking with the estate secretary about something involving a drainage report, and he happened to be standing in the entrance hall when she came through the door. And the conversation with the secretary came to a natural pause at the precise moment she began unbuttoning her coat. It was possible this was coincidence. "Dr. Marsh?" he said. "Yes." She handed her coat to the footman. "Hobbs said you'd gone to call on him." "That I did." He looked at her for a moment. The estate secretary had found something of urgent interest in his drainage report. "The withdrawal from Dalton has been replaced." She pulled off her gloves. "1 finger at a time. In principle. The formal letter will go out Monday. The new arrangement is for 5 years rather than annually. Which is an improvement on the original terms. Something crossed his face that she had begun to recognize the rapid recalibration of a man whose expectations have not been met in the direction had anticipated. You might have come to me. He said that I handled it, Clarissa. It was the first time he had used her given name without the prefix. She was not sure he had noticed. She kept her expression level and waited. The home's patronage is a ducal concern, he said. If there are funding difficulties, that's something I should be involved in. You are involved. Your name is on the letterhead. She met his eyes. The problem was a donor who withdrew because someone described me as an unstable appointment. I went and replaced him with someone who has spent 11 years understanding what the Home Act usually does. A beat involving you would have required explaining why I was unstable, which would have required repeating the original comment. Which I didn't see the use of. He was quiet. That I am not being. He started. That I know you're not. She said it without impatience. You were going to offer to help. I appreciate that. She held his gaze. I didn't need it. And you didn't lose anything by my going. The terms are better than before. A pause. Measured. You have the drainage problem. I have the home. Neither of us has to manage both. He looked at her for a moment longer. She had the sense, again, of that internal calculation, something working beneath the correct surface of his expression, reaching a conclusion she wasn't privy to. Marsh. He said finally. He agreed to 5 years. He agreed to 5 years. Adrian liked him, yes. She said. That's why I went to him. The estate secretary had abandoned all pretense of studying the drainage report and was now examining a point on the wall with intense concentration. Alexander glanced at him, then back at Clarissa, and something in his bearing shifted. Not a softening, exactly, but the very slight release of a tension she had not realized he was carrying. The formal letter, he said. I'll sign it Monday, thank you. She moved toward the stairs. She had reached the 3rd step when he said, behind her, how did you know he'd agree? She paused without turning. I gave him something he wanted more than money, the medical notes. Yes. A silence in which she could hear the estate secretary very carefully not moving. You've been carrying those since the estate was settled. Alexander said. It was not a question. 8 months. I didn't know what else to do with them. She continued up the stairs. They were too important to file. She did not look back. But she heard, as she rounded the landing, the quiet sound of Alexander saying something to the estate secretary in a voice too low to carry, and then, beneath that, a silence with a different quality than the silences she had come to expect from him. Less like the absence of speech and more like the presence of something he hadn't yet found words for. She had learned, over the course of 3 years, to recognize the difference. He came to find her on a Thursday evening, which was unusual, because he did not generally come to find her. She was in the morning room with the household accounts, the lamp turned up high against the early dark. A cup of tea gone cold at her elbow. She heard the knock and said come in, and he came in, and she noted the hour 8:30 and the fact that he was still in his day clothes. Which meant he had come directly from the study rather than changing for an evening he did not intend to spend in company. He sat down across from her without being invited. She found she did not mind. I've been looking at the Haverstock Boundary Survey, he said. The 1809 document. You cited Clause 14 at the council meeting. Yes, you cited it correctly. Pemberton knew you'd cited it correctly. Which is why he didn't argue. He paused. He would have argued if he'd thought there was any room. I know. She turned a page in the ledger. Pemberton argues when he senses uncertainty. It's a reliable system, useful to understand. Alexander was quiet for a moment. She continued with the accounts. Because the accounts required finishing and because she had learned, in the past weeks, that he often needed silence to locate what he was actually trying to say. You chose Adrian, he said. She looked up. He was looking at the middle distance. At a point somewhere between her desk and the window. In the manner of a man who has decided that direct eye contact would make what he is about to say harder to finish. You chose to accept his proposal. No one compelled you. I've looked into it. Your family made no particular pressure. You were not in financial difficulty. You had other options. A pause. I want to understand why. She set down her pen. You've been looking into my family's finances, she said. Yes, why? He was quiet for long enough that she had time to formulate 3 possible answers on his behalf. Then he said. Because there's a version of events in which you made a calculation. Engaged to a dying man. Waiting for the title to pass to the younger son. He said it with the flat precision of someone who has rehearsed the words in order to be able to say them without inflection. I wanted to know if that version was true. Clarissa looked at him for a moment. He had turned to face her now. And his expression had the quality she associated with the churchyard, a man in a room he thought was empty, with the careful assembly temporarily down. What made you think it might be? She said, nothing. You did everything Margaret Croft implied, and you looked into my family's finances because of something Margaret Croft implied that I looked into it because I needed to know. He held her gaze. I'm telling you that I looked. Because I think you'd want to know that I looked. She considered that. It was, she decided, an unusual form of honesty, not quite an apology, not quite a confession, but something in the same register as both. That I knew Adrian would die, she said. From the second winter of our engagement. I understood it clearly. I stayed because she chose the words with the same deliberateness she gave to the estate ledgers, each one placed where it belonged, because he was frightened, and he had very little time. And there was no one else who was going to stay. She paused. It was not a calculation. It was a decision. Those are different things that I know. Dou, he didn't answer immediately. Outside the window, the wind had come up. And she could hear it in the eaves, that particular sound of winter making itself known in old houses. Why father thought you were a practical choice for Adrian, he said. Good blood, modest expectations, unlikely to make difficulties. He said as much at dinner. The night the arrangement was first discussed. He stopped. I was present. I didn't. Another stop, this one longer. I disagreed with his assessment. She watched him. That's all, he said. With the slight abruptness of a man who has said more than he planned and is withdrawing to a defensible position. I only wanted you to know the question of why you stayed. I believe you. I should have. He stood. I should not have needed to ask. She rose as well. Not because she needed to, but because the conversation seemed to require it. You were going to say something else, she said. When you said you disagreed with his assessment. That he looked at her. 1 beat, 2. Good night, Clarissa, he said. She let him reach the door. Then. For what it's worth, I disagreed with his assessment too. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He did not turn around. But she saw the slight change in the line of his shoulders, the thing that happened when something reached him that he had not braced for. Good night. She said. He left. She sat back down, and looked at the accounts, and found that the figures required rather more attention than usual for the next several minutes. She found the diary by accident. This was, she thought afterward, entirely consistent with how the important things tended to happen, not through deliberate searching but through the ordinary movements of a life that occasionally put you in the path of what you needed to find. She had been looking for the 1811 property survey, which Hobbs believed was filed in the library's East Cabinet under estate correspondence, but which had, with the particular stubbornness of documents that were urgently needed, failed to be there. She had worked her way along the cabinet's lower shelf, pulling folders and replacing them, and had reached a section labeled in a hand she didn't recognize as either Hobbs or the estate secretary, smaller, more compressed, with the look of writing done quickly and privately. The label read, R.R. Personal, Adrian Robert Redfield. His handwriting on the label. She should have left it. She pulled it out instead, because she was the kind of person who, having been handed a piece of information, found willful ignorance more difficult to manage than uncomfortable knowledge. Inside were perhaps 30 pages of irregular entries, not a formal diary. More the accumulation of notes a man makes when he has things to work through and insufficient people to work through them with. The dates spanned 3 years. The first entries were from the summer before their engagement. The last was dated 6 weeks before his death, she sat down on the floor of the library with the folder in her lap and read. Adrian wrote the way he had spoken, with the ease of a man for whom words were furniture that had always been arranged to his convenience. And with the occasional gap where he had assumed the reader would follow him without assistance. She found herself annotating mentally, filling in the spaces. The early entries were about the illness, the first diagnosis, the second opinion that confirmed the first. The process of deciding what to do with the time he had been given. He wrote about her with the directness she had come to expect from him. C is exactly what I need. She doesn't perform sympathy. She just stays. She read for 20 minutes before she found it was in an entry from the autumn before they became engaged, a year before she had met him, a year and a half before any arrangement had been discussed. The entry was short. One of the shorter ones, and it had the look of something written quickly, as though the thought had needed to be recorded before it was reconsidered. Alex saw her first. At the Pemberton Literary Evening she said something about Keats that he's been thinking about ever since. I can tell from the way he doesn't mention her. He won't say anything. He never does. It's one of his more predictable qualities that I asked Father to arrange the introduction. She sat with that for a moment, then she read it again. Alex saw her first. She became aware, slowly, that she had been holding the folder very still in both hands, the way she had learned to hold things when she needed to be certain she would not drop them. She thought about the portrait above the fireplace. Adrian, straight-shouldered and easy. Alexander at the left edge of the frame, holding himself with careful economy. She thought about the library door, half open, the letter in his hands and the particular angle of his body when he heard her footstep. She thought about the carriage to the Ashworth ball, his eyes at the window, and the waltz, and you didn't need me. Said with a weight she had not fully understood at the time that I asked Father to arrange the introduction. She stood up. She put the folder back in the cabinet, in the section labeled ARR Personal. She stood at the cabinet for a moment, her hand still on the folder, and conducted a brief internal negotiation with herself about what she intended to do. Then she went to find Alexander. That he was in the study, as he usually was at this hour, with the estate accounts and a lamp and the self-contained quality of a man accustomed to working alone. He looked up when she came in without knocking. She placed the folder on the desk between them. That he looked at it. His expression did not change. But something shifted in the quality of his stillness, a different kind of stillness than the one he wore for councils and carriages and formal dinners. The East Cabinet. He said. Lower shelf. That I was looking for the 1811 survey. That I know where the 1811 survey is. I should have told you. He looked at the folder and nodded her. You've read it. That it was not a question. She didn't answer it. There's an entry, she said. Autumn. 3 years ago. A literary evening. The lamp between them threw his face half into shadow. He was very still. He wrote that you heard something I said about Keats, she said. That you'd been thinking about it. He wrote. She stopped for a beat. That you wouldn't say anything. That you never do. Silence. She waited. She had learned, in the past weeks, that he often needed silence to locate what he was actually trying to say. She gave him the silence. Keats, he said at last, wrote about death more convincingly than he wrote about love. He said it carefully, with the quality of a man quoting rather than composing, because he understood what he was writing about. You said the courage in his work wasn't the love, it was the dying. Anyone can write about wanting something. Not everyone can write about knowing you won't have it. She looked at him. That was W. Had you said, he said. At the Pemberton evening. You were arguing with a man who thought the odes were fundamentally optimistic, and you said. He stopped. You probably don't remember. That I remember. He looked up then, for the first time since she had entered the room. That I was the second son. He said. I was not. He chose the word carefully, in a position to say anything. And then my father arranged the introduction, and Adrian a pause. Adrian was always better at the things that mattered in drawing rooms. He was warm. He made people feel at ease. By the time I understood what he was doing, you had already agreed to the engagement. You let him, she said. Not an accusation. An observation, placed carefully. Yes, why? He was quiet for long enough that she might have thought he wasn't going to answer, except that she had learned to read his silences by now, and this one had the quality of a man not refusing to answer but working toward one that was true, because he was dying, he said. And he wanted something. And it was something I could let him have. And because he stopped. Because I thought it would be easier, at the end of it. If I had never another stop. It wasn't easier. She looked at him in the lamplight. He was looking back at her with the expression she had seen only twice before in the churchyard, and in the carriage after the Ashworth ball, the expression that was not the Duke of Redfield but simply Alexander. Without the careful assembly, "Why are you telling me this now?" She said, "Because you found it. And because I'm tired." His voice was quiet, deliberate. "Of allowing you to believe that I married you because there was no other option. There were other options. I did not take them." The lamp flickered. Outside. The wind moved through the eaves. She thought about the note on the silver tray. "You're expected." She thought about the 43 buttons she had unfastened alone in the gray November morning. She thought about "Pretend you love me." Said in the doorway with the quality of a man offering the only thing he believed himself entitled to ask, "The Keats," she said. "What I said about the courage being in the dying, not the love, yes, that I was wrong." She said. "About which part was harder to write that he waited, wanting something you believe you can't have," she said. "Takes a particular kind of courage too." She held his gaze. "I've been doing it for several weeks now. It's not easier than dying. It's just quieter." The quality of the silence that followed was different from any silence she had experienced in this house. It had no management in it, no careful distance. No assembly of correct presentation. It was simply two people in a room with a lamp and a folder of dead man's notes and the particular gravity of a conversation that had shifted into territory neither of them had fully mapped. That he reached across the desk, not for the folder. For nothing. He simply reached, and his hand was on the desk between them, open, and she understood with the clarity of someone who had been reading silences for 3 years that this was the closest he knew how to come to asking. She looked at his hand for a moment, then she looked at him. "That I am not ready," she said. "Not yet. But I need you to know." She chose the words the way she chose everything now, with care, "that I'm not pretending anymore. I haven't been, for some time." That he nodded. Once. With the precision of a man receiving something he intends to keep safe, she left the folder on the desk. She left the room without looking back, because she had learned that some things required processing in private, and this the quiet, irrevocable fact of "he saw me first" was one of them. She walked upstairs with the particular composure of a woman who had reached the top of something steep and was allowing herself, only now, to notice how long the climb had been. The rumor reached her on a Monday, which was, she reflected, a particularly efficient day for damage. She heard it first from the housekeeper, not directly, because Mrs. Alderton was too careful a woman for directness, but in the form of a question about whether the London house would be opened for the full season. Phrased with the particular delicacy of someone who wanted to know whether the new Duchess of Redfield intended to be publicly visible and, if so, how soon. Clarissa said yes, the full season. And asked why Mrs. Alderton was asking now rather than in January when the question was usually settled. Mrs. Alderton said she had heard something at the village market. From the butcher's wife. Who had it from the draper's assistant. Who had been at a delivery at Croft House on Saturday. Margaret Croft. Clarissa listened to the summary with the expression she reserved for information she intended to process privately. Then she thanked Mrs. Alderton, asked her to proceed with the London house preparations, and went back to the quarterly accounts. The rumor, as Mrs. Alderton had reconstructed it, was this: that Clarissa had been aware, from the beginning of her engagement to Adrian, that the younger son had formed an attachment to her. And that she had deliberately maintained the engagement to the elder brother in order to secure the higher likelihood of a dukedom, since Adrian's health ensured the title would pass. And Alexander's comparative lack of other marital prospects ensured she would be the natural recipient of it. The whole arrangement, in this version of events, had been a calculated patience. She finished the quarterly accounts. She ate dinner alone, as she often did when Alexander was in the North Field dealing with the drainage works. She read for an hour. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. By Tuesday morning she had the shape of the thing clearly enough to know what mattered and what didn't. What didn't matter, her own reputation. At least in the immediate term, because she had spent 3 years managing worse. What did matter, the home, whose subscription list would respond poorly to its patron being described in drawing rooms as a calculating social climber. What also mattered, in a way she was not yet ready to examine too closely, that someone was actively working to establish a version of events in which everything that had happened, including what had been said in the study, with the lamp and the folder between them, was consistent with a premeditated scheme. Alexander returned from the north field at 6. She was in the morning room when she heard him in the hall, his voice with the estate manager, brief, then his footsteps. And then the morning room door opening that he came in already knowing. She could see it in the quality of his stillness when he entered, not the managed stillness of ordinary evenings but the particular quality of a man who has been thinking about something for several hours and has arrived at the point of needing to address it. That I heard from Pemberton, he said. This afternoon. Which version did Pemberton have? The version in which you selected Adrian strategically and have been managing me with similar deliberateness since the marriage. He said it with the flat precision of a man reading from a document. He wanted to know if I was aware. And are you? She said. Aware that he was quiet. The lamp was lit. Outside the window, the last of the evening light was failing over the moors, that particular gradation from grey to darker grey that she had come to associate with Yorkshire winters. That he said nothing for 3 minutes. She counted. Not deliberately, but because the silence had a weight that made measurement feel necessary. That I don't. He started. You do, she said. You're standing there and you've been standing there for 3 minutes and you haven't said that it isn't true. Which means some part of you is deciding whether it might be. Her voice was even. She had made it even deliberately, the way she made the estate ledgers even, because the numbers mattered more than the feeling about the numbers. That's 3 minutes. Alexander. I sat by Adrian's bed for 18 months. I managed the accounts he couldn't manage and the correspondence he couldn't manage, and the mornings when he woke up frightened and needed someone to tell him it was all right and mean it. She paused. I am asking you to consider what version of me could do all of that as a calculation. That he looked at her. I don't believe it, he said. You do, a little. That's what the 3 minutes were. He didn't deny it. 3 minutes, she said again, quietly now. That's all it took. Margaret Croft says something at a dinner party. And 3 minutes. She rose from the chair, not from agitation but from the simple requirement of not being seated for the rest of this. After the library. After everything in the library, Clarissa. I'm not angry. She said it because it was true. Which surprised her slightly. I'm not. I understand it. I understand that there was someone before me who made trusting people cost more than you could afford. And I understand that this is what that cost looks like in practice. 3 minutes of silence when someone gives you a reason to doubt. She looked at him directly. But I need you to understand what it costs on my side. That he was very still. That I have been here for 2 months. She said. I have managed the home and the accounts and the parish obligations and 4 dinners and 1 ball, and I have done all of it correctly because that is what I know how to do. And in the library. She stopped, finding the words with the same deliberateness she gave to everything that mattered. In the library. I told you something true. That I had stopped pretending. And 3 minutes ago you stood in this doorway and wondered if the whole thing was a scheme. She held his gaze. That is what it costs. The silence after that was different from the 3 minutes. It had something in it, not comfort. Not resolution, but the quality of a space in which something had been accurately named and could not be unnamed. That I know. He said. That I know you know. She moved toward the door. I'm going to bed. You should eat something, Mrs. Alderton said. The north field took most of the day. Clarissa, she stopped. That I will fix it. He said. The rumor. I'll find where it came from and I'll fix it. She looked at him over her shoulder. His face had the quality she had seen in the churchyard strip of the managed presentation, carrying something she could not name but recognized. That I know you will. She said. That's not the part I'm asking you to fix. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while, not from distress but from the simple need to be still. Then she lit the lamp, and picked up her book. And read for an hour without retaining a single sentence that I in her coat pocket. Her fingers found the small, cool weight of the loose pearl button. She had not put it back. She had not thrown it away. She held it for a moment, then set it on the nightstand where the lamp cast the least light. And went to sleep. He was gone when she came down on Wednesday morning, not from the house. His coat was on the stand, his boots by the door, but from the room she had come to associate with his presence at that hour. The study was empty, the breakfast room was empty, and Hobbs, when asked, said his Grace had gone out early and had taken the carriage toward London. She ate breakfast. She wrote 3 letters for the home. She met with the estate secretary about the Haverstock fence repair, which had been ongoing since October and showed no signs of resolving itself before spring. She did not ask where Alexander had gone, because she had decided, somewhere in the sleepless middle of the previous night, that she was not going to manage this the way she managed the accounts, by tracking every figure and accounting for every variable. Some things required waiting. She was not good at waiting. She had, however, had practiced. He returned on Thursday evening. She was in the library when she heard the carriage. She did not go to the entrance hall. She remained where she was, with the 1811 property survey that she had finally located in the attic storage rather than the east cabinet. And she listened to the sounds of his return, the door, the voices. Hobbs measured greeting and continued to read. He knocked before he came in, which he had not done before. She looked up. He was still in his traveling coat, which meant he had come directly from the carriage. In his hand was a document folder, not the estate kind, the legal kind, with the solicitor's mark on the cover. He set it on the table beside her survey. Margaret Croft was the source, he said. She repeated it at 2 dinners and a tea, all in the same week, which suggests it was organized rather than opportunistic. He opened the folder. Inside were 4 pages of closely written notes, and beneath those, 2 letters. I have statements from 3 of the people present at those occasions. The letters are from witnesses who can attest to the original conversation in which she established the terms of the story. He paused. She told the same lie with the same words in 3 separate locations. Which means it was rehearsed. That will matter if it becomes necessary to escalate formally. Clarissa looked at the documents, then she looked at him. You went to London to investigate Margaret Croft. She said that in 2 days that I had motivation to be efficient. She looked back at the documents. The statements were thorough. She could see that from a glance, the dates, the named witnesses, the specific language identified as repeated. He had not done this carelessly, Alexander. She said, there's something else. He reached into the folder and removed the 2 letters, setting them apart from the statements. These are not from witnesses to the rumor. These are. He paused, choosing. Adrian kept a correspondence with our cousin Edmund from the last year of his illness. Edmund has been in Edinburgh, which is why they weren't included in the estate settlement. He sent them when I wrote to explain the situation. She looked at the letters. The handwriting on both was Adrian's. The relevant passage is on the 3rd page of the 2nd letter. Alexander said. He did not indicate it further. He stepped back from the table and stood at the window, giving her the distance that the thing seemed to require. She turned to the 3rd page. Adrian had written it in January, 4 months before he died. The letter was largely about Edinburgh and the cold and Edmund's new house, and then toward the end, in the manner of a man recording something he wanted to witness. I have been thinking about what happens after. I know that's a morbid subject for a letter, but bear with me. The arrangement with Alex is settled as agreed, and I won't insult either of you by describing it as a sacrifice, because it isn't one, and he knows it isn't. Even if he can't say so yet. See, doesn't know about his knowing. She thinks it's obligation. I've decided not to correct her because I think it will be more useful, in the end, for Alex to do it himself. He needs to learn to say the thing, rather than simply feeling it and hoping the furniture arrangement communicates it. God knows I never managed to teach him while I was healthy enough to try. What I want Edmund to know, what I want on record. In case it matters Latterus, that she didn't choose me for the title and she didn't stay for the prospect of what came after. She stayed because she is fundamentally incapable of leaving a room in which someone needs her to stay. I've tested this theory extensively and it holds that if Alex doesn't tell her what she's worth, someone should. You're my witness. She read it twice. She was aware, at the edges of her attention, of Alexander at the window, the quality of his stillness, the careful distance he had placed between himself and the table. She thought about the morning room. 2 days ago. 3 minutes of silence. I don't believe it. The part she had said out loud and the part she hadn't, that 3 minutes was not very long, really. Measured against the weight of what he was managing. That she understood what trust cost when it had been spent badly before. That understanding it and being hurt by it were not mutually exclusive. She set the letter down. That he knew, she said. That you'd agreed. He knew it wasn't obligation. Alexander said. From the window. Yes, that he decided not to tell me because he thought you should do it yourself. A pause. That is consistent with Adrian. She looked at the letter again. She is fundamentally incapable of leaving a room in which someone needs her to stay. She thought about the 43 buttons. The cold mornings in the estate office. The way she had stood in the library doorway and not said good evening and let him go on thinking it was all management and performance and duty. The 3 minutes. She said that I know. His voice was quiet and entirely without defense. I know what the 3 minutes cost. He stopped. I've been afraid, since the library, that I'd find a reason to ruin it. And when Pemberton told me, didn't believe it. But I knew I had to be certain. And the process of being certain, he turned from the window, the process of needing certainty is itself a kind of doubt. You named it correctly. She sat with that for a moment. What do you want from me? She asked. Not unkindly. He crossed from the window to the table not far. The room was not large and stood on the other side of it, and looked at her with the expression that was not the Duke of Redfield that I'd like, he said, to stop requiring proof of things that shouldn't need proving. He paused. I recognize that's something I have to do. Rather than something you can give me. Another pause, shorter. But I would also, he stopped, say it, she said that I would also like, he looked at the letter, and then at her, to stop being the person you haven't decided about yet. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside. The wind had come up again, the winter pressing against the old walls of the library with the impartial persistence it had been pressing since November. I told you in the library, she said carefully. That I wasn't ready. That's still true. She watched his face, the slight tightening that he controlled before it became visible, the management reasserting itself. But the 3 minutes, she said. And what you did about them, those are different things. You found 3 statements and 2 letters in 2 days. She glanced at the folder. You went to London because you were afraid you'd been wrong, and you came back with evidence, and the evidence is, she paused. Adrian's handwriting. Which you knew would matter to me. Which means you knew what I needed to see, not just what would legally resolve the question. That he was very still. That, she said, is not nothing. She closed the property survey. She stood, she did not take his hand, she was not ready for that. And she had said so, and she intended to mean what she said. But she picked up Adrian's letter from the table, carefully, and held it for a moment. That he says you need to learn to say the thing. She said. Rather than hoping the furniture arrangement communicates it, something shifted in Alexander's expression, something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood, involuntary and briefly unguarded. That sounds like him. He said, yes. She set the letter back down. I'll make you a proposal. We continue as we are, civilly, carefully. But the next time you have something to say, you say it. And I'll do the same. She met his eyes. No more furniture arrangements. That he looked at her steadily. All right. He said. She picked up her survey and left him with the letters and the lamp and whatever he chose to do with the particular quality of the silence she left behind. The Convalescent Home's winter fundraising evening was held on the first Friday of December. In the assembly rooms on Ansford Road that Adrian had hired for the same purpose 3 years running, Clarissa had managed the arrangements herself, the invitations, the program, the placement of tables. The careful calibration of which donors should be seated near which other donors and which conversations were likely to produce the most productive results. She had done this before, for Adrian, when the illness had made the social requirements difficult. She found she was better at it now, which she attributed to knowing the room more thoroughly and caring less about being liked by its occupants. Alexander had agreed to attend. He had said so with the brevity that indicated genuine assent rather than performed cooperation. And he had appeared on the evening in question in the correct dress with the correct punctuality, and she had noted both without comment. The room was full. Dr. Marsh was there, speaking with 2 physicians from York whom Clarissa had invited specifically because Marsh had mentioned, in passing, that a collaboration on the question of winter respiratory illness in children would benefit from their involvement. Lord and Lady Fenwick were there, maintaining the distant cordiality she had established at the Ashworth ball. Pemberton was there, which was necessary even if not welcome. Because Pemberton's visible presence was read by the room as an endorsement of stability, and stability was currently a useful message. Margaret Croft was also there. Clarissa had known she would be. She had, in fact, made certain of it. Invitation had gone out at the same time as all the others, with the same pleasant wording. Because uninviting Margaret Croft would have been a statement, and statements of that kind were most effective when made in person. She saw her arrive from across the room. Margaret Croft was perhaps 45. With the bearing of a woman who had once been the most important person in any room she entered and had not entirely reconciled herself to the possibility that this might have changed. She was dressed well. She had brought her husband. Which was either confidence or strategy, someone to retreat to if the evening required it. Clarissa continued her conversation with Lady Fenwick. The first hour proceeded as these evenings were designed to proceed. Introductions. Subscriptions discussed with the warm indirectness that the occasion demanded. 2 brief remarks from Dr. Marsh about the home's work that were received with the attentiveness of people who had eaten well and were feeling generous. Alexander moved through the room with the efficiency she had come to recognize as his form of social engagement, brief, substantive. Leaving each conversation with the other party looking as though they had said something worth hearing, she was speaking with the York physicians about the respiratory study when she became aware of Margaret Croft at her elbow. "Your Grace." The tone was the same one from the Ashworth ball, intimate, warm, calibrated for an audience. "What a success. You've managed this beautifully, thank you," Clarissa said. "Dr. Marsh has been invaluable. The work recommends itself. Of course." A pause, in which Margaret Croft smiled at the York physicians with the smile of a woman clearing a space for a private conversation. The physicians, reading the social requirement, found reasons to be elsewhere. "I wanted to say I hope there are no hard feelings about the things that were said. People will talk, and one can't always control what." "No," Clarissa said pleasantly. Margaret Croft paused. "I beg your pardon. No hard feelings." Clarissa met her eyes with the expression she reserved for Pemberton when he was being imprecise about figures, attentive, patient, entirely uninformative. "Although I wonder if you might clarify something for me. The statement you made at the Hardcastle dinner, the one about my engagement to Adrian being strategically maintained in anticipation of the title passing, you made it in the same words at the Fenwick tea and the Worthington end supper. Within a single week." She kept her voice at the register of 2 women discussing arrangements. That level of consistency suggests care. "I'm curious what the intended outcome was." Margaret Croft's expression did not change. But something in it located a new arrangementless warmth. "More attention that I am sure I don't know what you mean." She said that I think you do. Clarissa's voice remained level. "I think you knew Adrian well enough to know that the story was plausible to people who didn't. And I think you had reasons for wanting the current marriage to appear provisional." She paused. "I'm not going to ask what the reasons were. I don't need to know. I only want you to understand that the documents your story was intended to preempt already exist, have been reviewed by a solicitor, and are considerably more detailed than the story. A silence, now, Clarissa said, with the same pleasantness. I believe Lord Fenwick is looking for someone to discuss the York Road improvements with. You'd be very well suited to that conversation. Margaret Croft looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalculating a position. She moved toward Lord Fenwick. Clarissa turned back to find her champagne glass. She had covered perhaps 4 steps when she became aware that Alexander was beside her, not having appeared from nowhere, but having been, she realized, within range for the past several minutes, which she had not noticed. And which suggested he had been deliberate about it. That I heard most of that, he said quietly. That I know. She found her glass on the side table. I didn't need you to intervene. That I know you didn't. A pause. I wasn't going to. She looked at him. That I was going to watch, he said. With the directness that had become, in the past weeks, his version of the thing he'd called furniture arrangement, the thing he was learning to replace with actual speech. Because I wanted to see how you do it, and... His expression had the quality of the library, the careful assembly. Briefly down. You didn't raise your voice, he said. You didn't accuse her in front of the room. You told her exactly what you knew and exactly what you didn't need to do with it, and you redirected her to Fenwick, who will speak to her about roads for 40 minutes and consider himself well served. The roads improvement is a legitimate topic, Clarissa said. That it is. He was quiet for a moment. You gave her a way out that didn't require her to lose publicly. Shall take it. And shall be careful with you in future. And the room will have watched you speak to her pleasantly and conclude that whatever was said about you was exaggerated. She looked at him. You've been thinking about how to manage difficult people in rooms. I've been watching you manage difficult people in rooms for 6 weeks. He said. I've been paying attention. Across the room. Margaret Croft had located Lord Fenwick and the York Road improvements had apparently commenced. Pemberton was speaking with Dr. Marsh with the expression of a man who had not expected to find the conversation interesting and was being forced to revise this. The York physicians had resumed their discussion with Lady Fenwick. The room had the quality of an evening proceeding well, the particular hum of people who had come to give money to a good cause and were finding the social requirements of doing so less onerous than expected. There's something I need to say, Alexander said. She turned to look at him properly. He was facing the room rather than her, which she had come to understand was the posture he adopted when he was going to say something that required steadiness to finish. The lamplight in the assembly room was warmer than the lamplight at Redfield, and it did something to the angles of his face that made him look, for a moment, less like the portrait and more like the man at the left edge of it, one who had been learning to occupy less space and was, perhaps, beginning to reconsider. Adrian asked me to marry you, he said. I told you he requested it. I didn't tell you what he said when he asked. He paused. He said you were the kind of person who stayed when staying was difficult. He said he wanted you to have someone who would do the same. A pause. He said. Alexander stopped. And she heard in the stoppage the particular quality of a man locating courage for the last part of a sentence. He said he thought I was that person. That had known it for longer than I had. The room continued around them. Someone laughed at something near the fireplace. A chair scraped. That he was not wrong, Alexander said. He turned then to look at her directly. Without the management. I've been in the process of learning to say that. I'm saying it now. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the folder in the East cabinet. Alex saw her first. She thought about the carriage to the Ashworth ball, and the waltz, and you didn't need me. Said with the weight of a man who had just discovered this was true and found it mattered to him. She thought about the morning room, and the 3 minutes, and I will fix it, and the 2 days in London, and coming back with Adrian's handwriting. She thought about Pretend You Love Me. Said in a doorway in November with the register of a man offering the only thing he believed himself entitled to ask. That I know. She said. That he looked at her. I've known for some time, she said quietly, that you were that person. I was waiting for you to know it too. Across the room. Margaret Croft was listening to Lord Fenwick describe the drainage challenges on the north stretch of the York Road with the expression of a woman paying a debt she had agreed to pay. Dr. Marsh had extracted a small notebook from his coat pocket and was writing something down. which Pemberton was watching with the confused interest of a man encountering genuine enthusiasm for the first time in a professional context. Alexander had gone still beside her, not the managed stillness, but the other kind. The kind from the churchyard and the library and the morning room at 8:30 on a Thursday evening. She let the stillness be, then she said, "No more furniture arrangements." "You said you understood that I understand," he said, "then stop standing next to me and hoping you'll deduce the rest." She looked at him. "Say the thing." Alexander. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been offered something, had stopped expecting to be offered, and is making certain he has correctly identified what it is. Then he said, "I love you. I have loved you since before I had any right to. And I have managed this fact very badly, and I intend to spend a considerable amount of time making that legible in ways that don't require you to read the furniture." The room continued its hum. She felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as the absence of a weight she had been carrying since November, since the doorway, since the 43 buttons, since the silver tray and your expected, and the particular grey of a Yorkshire morning in which she had looked at herself in the glass and confirmed that the face would hold for one more day. That, she said, was the thing. The pearl button was still on her nightstand. She noticed it the following morning, in the early light, before the household had fully begun its day. She had not moved it. It had sat there since the night of the 3 minutes. Small and slightly iridescent in whatever light the room offered, and she had formed the habit of seeing it without looking at it, the way one forms habits around things that are waiting to be resolved. She picked it up. It was from the wedding gown. She did not need to remind herself of this, but she did anyway, as a form of accuracy. 43 buttons, mother of pearl, and this one had worked loose in the weeks after the wedding. During one of the days when she had been managing the accounts and the household and the parish obligations and the business of being a duchess in a house where she had not been asked if she wanted to be one, that she had not thrown it away. She had not known, at the time, why she hadn't. She thought she knew now. She was at her writing desk when Alexander knocked, which was how mornings had proceeded since the assembly rooms, with the knock that had not existed before, and with the particular quality of presence on the other side of the door that she was learning to identify as reliably as she identified the handwriting on estate documents. "Come in." She said that he came in. He was dressed for the day, which meant he had been up early, which she knew because she had been up early too and had heard his study door at some point before 7. They had, she reflected, similar habits around sleeplessness. That he had a letter in his hand, not a new one, she saw, but the Edinburgh letter, which he had apparently retrieved from the library. He set it on the desk beside her correspondence. "I thought you might want it," he said, "to keep, rather than in the estate files." She looked at the letter. Adrian's handwriting on the envelope, the compressed, slightly hurried script of a man who had more to say than his energy reliably permitted. She thought about what was on the 3rd page. She is fundamentally incapable of leaving a room in which someone needs her to stay. I've tested this theory extensively and it holds, thank you. She said. He remained standing, which meant there was something else. She waited. "Last night," he said. "What I said. I want to be certain that you." He stopped. "Revised. I'm not asking you to answer it in kind. I know that's notey. No, you said you weren't ready. In the library. I said it because it was true and because Adrian was right, that I needed to learn to say the thing, not because I require a particular response." She looked at him for a moment. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He chose the chair across from the desk rather than the one beside it, which was either courtesy or habit, and she made a note to address the habit in due course. "The button," she said. He looked at the nightstand, where she had left it. Then at her. "It's from the wedding gown," she said. "It came loose about 2 weeks in. I found it in my coat pocket and I didn't throw it away, and I didn't have it sewn back on." She picked it up from where she had set it on the desk and held it for a moment. "I've been carrying it since November. I didn't know why. For a long time." He was watching her with the attention he gave to things that mattered to him. "I think," she said, "that I kept it because it was the only part of that day that had come apart honestly. Everything else held together: the ceremony, the reception, the expressions, the correct answers to Lady Hardcastle's questions about children. Everything performed as required. She set the button on the desk between them. But this one worked loose on its own. Without being asked that he looked at the button. Then at her that I am not ready to say it in kind. She said. That's still true. She chose the words, I need a little more time to be certain that what I feel is what I feel, and not the accumulated effect of being in close proximity to someone who is trying very hard in ways that I find. She paused. In ways that I find difficult to be indifferent to. He said nothing. His expression had the quality she had come to trust more than his speech, because it was less subject to management. Present, steady, asking nothing, but I want you to know, she said. That the pretending stopped considerably before the library. I've been trying to identify exactly when, and I think it was the parish meeting. When you said of course. She looked at him. You didn't look at Pemberton. You looked at me. And it was only 2 words. But they were. She stopped. They were yours. Not the furniture. He was very still. So. She said. In the interest of no more furniture arrangements. She picked up the button and held it out to him across the desk. I don't need this sewn back onto a gown I'm not going to wear again. But I've been carrying it for 6 weeks and I'd rather. She found the words. I'd rather it was somewhere. It meant something. He looked at her hand. At the button. At her face. He reached out and took it carefully, the way he had reached across the library desk in October. With the quality of a man receiving something he intends to keep safe. He held it for a moment, then he said, when you're ready. I'm not in any difficulty about the time. I know, she said. That's one of the reasons. He looked at her with the expression that was not the Duke of Redfield. And she looked back, and outside the window the December light was arriving over the Yorkshire moors in the way she had grown accustomed, toggery and unhurried and indifferent to occasions, and she found, on balance, that she did not mind it. The parish council meets Thursday. She said, yes, Pemberton will try to reopen the Haverstock boundary question. He will. Alexander agreed. He won't get anywhere. No, he said, with the thing in his voice that was not quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. I don't imagine he will. She turned back to her correspondence. He remained in the chair across from the desk, not leaving, not requiring conversation, simply present in the manner of a man who had learned, or was learning. That presence could be offered without demand. She found it was not unpleasant. She found, after a few minutes, that it was not unlike the feeling of a room in which a fire had been lit at the correct hour and the right lamp had been turned up and all the figures in the ledger were where they were supposed to be, not the furniture, just the thing itself.